in the sauna. Wum bum bum bum. In Malmo. Bum 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 bum. In the sauna. Huh. I wonder. Ah. Hey, Nomi, how are you? Yeah, I'm pretty good, but... Yeah, I'm in a sauna right now in Malmo, Sweden. Yeah, but I gave the gang the week off. I mean, it's, one of our summer breaks. We made notes. I wrote a schedule. But they're not here. What would I do?
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
Comite, comitato, comitiet, comiteto, carul, comite, we young way, submiti, we committee.
Hi, and welcome to the committee program. I am your host, Arun Chaudhary. I'm so glad you could be here with us today. We are coming to you live from Malmo, Sweden, with a special episode. The gang is on vacation. They deserve it. They work relatively hard with, fairly consistent results, and I'm so grateful for that. And so I hope that they enjoy this week off, and I hope that you enjoy, and in case you missed it, episode with some of our favorite clips from the show that as it's already occurred. So without further ado, I'd like to bring you Stephen Kinzer and his talk with Julia Doubleday and I about cooing in Iran and about Mossadegh and about all of the things the U.S. government does when it doesn't like. And in this case, it's the British government. So why don't I backtrack on that and say... the British government, in this case, does the things that it doesn't want to do. It did it with the U.S. government. So it's the U.S. and... see what happens when the staff is away? Everything goes off the rails, okay? It's not making any sense. I don't have the notes. I'm just relying on my encyclopedic memory of how all of these things work. And frankly...
Hi, welcome back. So today on Deep Cuts, we have Stephen Kinzer joining us. He is the author of All the Shah's Men, An American Coup and the Roots of Middle East Terror. The book is about Iranian Prime Minister Mossadegh and his overthrow in 1953, which was organized by U.S. and British intelligence under President Eisenhower and Winston Churchill. The coup came after a years-long battle between Mossadegh's government and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, now known as British Petroleum, to nationalize Iran's oil. This event led to the oppressive regime of the Shah, which ultimately then led to the 1979 Islamic Revolution and the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini. Today we're going to talk about the details of the 1953 coup, about how it came about, the players involved, and what the consequences have been of this drastic foreign policy decision, which resound to this day. So thank you so much for joining us, Stephen.
Always great to spread the word about this most important but not so widely understood historical episode.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I did not know about this coup until actually after college. So it's something that we're definitely not taught about in school, but it has so many ramifications.
And I want to give some credit to Bernie Sanders. I actually think the first person who said, in the last 30 years said the word Mossadegh out loud to general American public would have to be Senator Sanders.
I almost fell off my chair when I heard Sanders say, Mohammed Mossadegh, Prime Minister of Iran. Nobody's ever heard of Mossadegh. It came on in his debate with Hillary Clinton, and then he went on from there. I tell you something, it was a shock to me. Mossadegh made it into the mainstream of American politics, as he should have made it a long time before. So yes, I agree. I tip my hand to Bernie on that one. He must have been reading my book.
That's a good that's a good Bernie impression. We do a lot of those around here.
But I can do the voice.
You're in the running. So first I wanted to just talk a little bit about the background, how Mossadegh came to power. So can you tell us a little bit about what it was like on the ground? What was the Iranian oil company, now British Petroleum? What were they doing? Why was what they were doing unfair? And how did Mossadegh start to get this really populist, gigantic following in the country?
The people of Iran had been struggling since their constitutional revolution right after 1900 to establish democracy. They hadn't really succeeded in consolidating a democracy. Then during the Second World War, Iran was occupied by Allied forces. But by the time the war ended, and after the Allies left, it was finally possible for Iranians to go back to their original constitution and pick up where they left off and try to consolidate a real democracy. From that process emerged this remarkable figure, Mohammad Mossadegh. He was already an elderly figure then. He came from very sophisticated background, and his father had been finance minister for many years. He was the first Iranian to have a doctorate in laws from a European university. He was probably the most educated Iranian of his generation. He became prime minister of Iran in 1951. Now, because he was the product of a democratic process, it was natural that he would have to respond to the will of the Iranian people. And the number one challenge, the overwhelming fact of life for Iranians at that time, had to do with oil. Iran is sitting on an ocean of oil. But all of that oil, when Mossadegh came to power, was owned by a British company, which was in turn owned by the British government. So all the standard of living that the British people enjoyed during the 1920s and 30s and 40s was based on oil from Iran. All the factories, the trucks and buses were run on Iranian oil. The Royal Navy, which projected British power around the world, was run 100% on oil from Iran. Meanwhile, the people of Iran were living in some of the most miserable conditions in the world. So it was natural that when you had a democratic leader, who turned out to be Mossadegh, that leader's number one overwhelming priority would be, we have to take back control of our great natural resource. We have to use the profits from the oil to develop our country, not send the oil to Britain. It was the decision of the Iranian parliament to nationalize the oil industry that set off the chain of events that led to Mossadegh's overthrow.
Yeah, I was actually, I was just so impressed at the very end of your book. You talk about going to Mossadegh's house and how you talked to some kids in the street and they knew who he was and they knew he had nationalized oil, which I think really speaks to just how much his legacy looms large for people. Because, I mean, for a kid to know that, just a random kid you meet on the street, I think that's really impressive.
Can I ask,
but yeah,
the folks who sort of supported this in the in the Iranian street, not actually on the streets protesting, but just sort of was it a combination of the middle classes and the working classes? Was there sort of a consensus across Iranian society, or can you sort of play that out for us a little bit?
The vote in the Iranian parliament was unanimous in favor of nationalizing the oil. In fact, I'll tell you this little story. The prime minister before Mossadegh had been assassinated, so the parliament had to meet to choose a new prime minister, and all the eyes were on Mossadegh. He was the chairman of the oil committee. He had already been making speeches denouncing British control of Iranian oil, and as it seemed like he was going to be named as prime minister, he stood up and pulled a piece of paper out of his jacket pocket. This would be a great scene if they ever make a movie about this episode. And he essentially said, I will become prime minister, but under one condition. In my hand, I'm holding a proposal that will authorize the government to nationalize our oil resource. First, vote for this, and then make me prime minister. I will implement it.
I absolutely loved the amount of detail that you got into about Mossadegh's personality. He seems like he was such a showman and honestly kind of a drama queen. I mean, like, he continually announced he was quitting politics. He resigned as prime minister, when he actually resigned, I believe over the he was in a feud with the Shah over whether he could appoint the Minister of War. Everyone basically poured out into the street and insisted that he be returned to power. So it worked out for him. But I love that he, not a compromiser, such a character. I would love to hear your thoughts on him.
Mossadegh was a fascinating character. You're absolutely right. And when I was writing my book, All the Shah's Men, I was effectively living with Mossadegh in a kind of a little room for a while. And I've had to write books about other people that are less pleasant. But Mossadegh really was a fascinating guy. So as I said, he was an elderly feudal landlord, highly sophisticated and educated, but he'd lived many years in Switzerland. And I think maybe he got a little carried away with the democracy of Switzerland. For example, when the CIA sent mobs out onto the streets to try to foment his overthrow, he didn't want to send counter mobs because he thought, as a head of state, you don't send mobs onto the street.
Right.
He, at the very peak of the coup moment, at the week of the coup, when the city of Tehran was in upheaval and turmoil, leaders of the Communist Party came to him and said, "Give us guns and we will defend your constitutional government." His answer was, "If ever I agree to arm a political party, may God cut off my right arm." So he was very faithful to the forms of democracy. He was also extremely honest, which made him quite unique in the Iranian political pantheon. He was highly frugal. For example, when Kleenex came to Iran, he thought it was a waste that they were double ply, so he would peel them apart and use them one at a time. He also, you said he was theatrical. It's true, and he would sometimes work himself into such a fury when he was making his speeches denouncing the British and talking about what miserable suffering the Iranian people were going through. He would work himself into such emotion that he'd actually collapse on the floor of Parliament. Now, it was never really clear if these collapses were fully physical or if they were partly psychological or even kind of planned out in advance. In the West, this kind of emotional extreme was used to ridicule him. He was called the fainting fanatic. But in Iran, where the depth of genuine emotion is something that plays out in politics as well as in other areas of life, it gave him the air of one of these fundamentalist preachers who whips his flock while urging them on to greatness. And that's what Mossadegh was doing for Iran.
Well, so I want to go back a little bit to talk about right after Mossadegh decided, and the parliament voted to nationalize oil. Right away, the British had absolutely no intention of compromising at all with the Iranians. They just saw this as like a total violation of their legal rights to the oil. Can you talk a little bit about like what the strategies were initially that they were trying to employ to get Mossadegh to either come to the table or really just get things back to normal with them sort of owning the oil legally?
It's a very interesting story, and in All the Shah's Men, I try to take the threats and the different means that the British and the Americans tried to use step by step. So, as you said, as soon as the oil nationalization was passed in Parliament and made Iranian law, the British essentially kind of laughed it off. They were used to dealing with what they called the wogs, the peasants, the people out there in those faraway colonies, and they never took seriously the possibility that their position could be threatened. It never had occurred to them that they would not be in Iran forever and that they would not own the oil of Iran forever. It seemed like a permanent fact of life. So the act of Parliament was just nothing serious. The first British response when it seemed to be serious was to ask their ambassador in Tehran, how much money did Mossadegh would like to have wired to some Swiss bank account so he would forget this nationalization foolishness. And the ambassador wrote back, that policy is not going to work with Mossadegh for sure, even though it had worked many times for other Iranians and people in other countries where the British exercised their pernicious influence. So the British then embarked on a series of steps. which they said were aimed at assuring their continued ownership of something that was their property, right, and preventing the Iranians from stealing something which the British owned by legal contract. That was the British approach. So the first thing the British did was to announce that the refinery, which they had built, it was the biggest refinery in the world, would be closed. Now, the British had promised in their original contract to train Iranian technicians to run the refinery, but they had never complied with that. So the British required all their technicians at the refinery to go home to Britain. Many wanted to stay, and Mossadegh offered them continued pay and benefits just like they'd been receiving before. But the British wanted to make that refinery stop working, so they required those people to go. They even put ads in newspapers in other countries that had oil industries warning oil experts not to go to Iran and help Iran extract oil, because that would be participating in the theft of British property. The British then imposed a naval blockade around the Abadan refinery, just in case the Iranians would find some way to extract some oil and put it on a tanker. Then the British imposed what we would today call sanctions. They froze Iranian assets in British banks. They stopped exporting some vital goods, everything from concrete to tea. None of that worked. Then the British became really serious, and they started to come up with the idea that they would invade Iran. They would actually stage a military operation, either to overthrow Mossadegh or simply to capture the area where the oil fields and the refinery were. When President Truman heard about this in Washington, he went nuts. And he told the British that that's absolutely out of the question. You cannot be invading Iran. So then the British decided to take their case to the Security Council of the United Nations. And they wanted the UN to order Iran give back the oil company to its rightful owner, the British. To everybody's shock, Mossadegh in Tehran decided, I'm going to go to New York. I'm going to go to the UN myself. And he did. Now, this was the first time that the leader of a poor, resource-producing country had ever taken the world stage like this. This was before Castro, before Lumumba, before Nkrumah, before Sukarno. And Mossadegh carried with him not just the desire of the people of Iran to control their own oil, but the desire of people all over the developing world, new countries that were emerging in Asia and Africa, to control their own resources. And indeed, this was part of the reason why the West was so panicked at what Mossadegh was doing. It's bad enough to lose control of the oil in Iran, but it's even worse to set the example that countries everywhere that produce things that rich countries need can set their own prices and control their own resources. So the United Nations, for the first time in its young history, after hearing from Mossadegh, refused to approve a motion submitted by one of the Security Council permanent members, the British. They wouldn't order Mossadegh to give back the oil company. Then the British took Mossadegh to the World Court in The Hague. They asked the World Court to order Mossadegh to desist. The World Court also refused after hearing from Iranian lawyers. So this left the British in a kind of a panic. They were starting to realize that they could be losing their most valuable asset in the whole world, which is what that refinery was. Then they decided they had to overthrow Mossadegh. So what they did was they had secret agents who were posing as diplomats in Tehran bribe members of the Iranian parliament to prepare them to vote a no confidence measure, which you can do in any parliamentary democracy. But Tehran was a small town in those days, and news gets around fast. Mossadegh figured out what was happening, and he did the only thing that he could have done to protect himself, which was to close the British embassy and send home all the British diplomats, among them, of course, all the spies that had been bribing members of parliament. So now the British were naked. They had nothing in Tehran, And they were on the brink of this huge loss, which was unimaginable to them.
Yes,
and that is when they turned to the Americans.
Right. So this was something, there was a major shift in the middle of the book this is something I didn't know anything about. I definitely knew America was involved in the coup, but it was super interesting reading about the differences between Truman's foreign policy and Eisenhower. So Truman basically kept telling the British, like, look, this is your issue. Like, you got to come to the table. Sometimes he would send sort of middlemen to try to negotiate between the two parties. But again, neither of them were willing to compromise. And then when Eisenhower got elected, it was right away. I mean, before he was even in office, he had people who were coming into his administration calling up the British being like, yep, let's do this. Let's get him out. And this is where we have some of the most major players in the coup coming onto the scene, Kermit Roosevelt and the Dulles brothers. So tell us about Kermit and the Dulles brothers and how America sort of became actually central to the coup.
CIA was created in 1947. And he did use the CIA for covert action, but he drew the line at overthrowing governments. He wasn't going to go that far. And was explicit, not only in Iran, but also in Guatemala when there was an effort by the CIA to get his approval for overthrowing a government in Guatemala. He absolutely refused to do that. So the election of 1952, as you said, brought Dwight Eisenhower into the presidency. More important, it brought John Foster Dulles to the position of Secretary of State and his brother, Allen Dulles, to the position of CIA director. Now, these two had spent much of their career working at the legendary Wall Street law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. That wasn't a normal law firm, as you think of that term. It was a very specialized operation. And it was designed that the law firm had a specific goal, which was to defend the rights of American corporations working in foreign countries. So every major American corporation that had business abroad had Sullivan and Cromwell as their counsel. And John Foster Dulles was the managing partner for decades at Sullivan and Cromwell. So the defense of American corporate power was central to their ideology. And the only other thing that was that strong was anti-communism. So these made them particularly focused on Mossadegh. Both of them had actually been active in Iran and had one of their major Sullivan and Cromwell engineering projects undermined and killed by Mossadegh and his National Front, who considered this to be an American imposition. So the Dulles brothers came into office gunning for Mossadegh. Actually, according to the last couple of biographies of Eisenhower, he didn't. He came into office without any particular feelings about Mossadegh one way or the other. But the Dulles brothers brought him around to the idea that Mossadegh was hugely dangerous and had to be overthrown. Now, how did this process begin? You mentioned quite correctly that the British were so excited at the prospect that they could get something going in Iran and finally get rid of what they called this madman Mossadegh, that they didn't even wait for Eisenhower to be inaugurated. They sent one of their top secret agents to Washington to try to persuade the new incoming group to reverse Truman's policy and agree to help overthrow Mossadegh. Now, this secret agent, Christopher Montague Woodhouse, who was formerly the head of the British Secret Service station in Tehran before Mossadegh closed the embassy, later wrote a memoir, and he devotes a few pages to this mission. And there, I'm going to paraphrase him. He says something like this: as I was flying across the Atlantic, I was thinking to myself, how am I going to propose to the Americans that they should overthrow Mossadegh? I realized that the argument we had been using was not going to work. That argument was, this crazy Mossadegh took away our oil company. Please overthrow him so we can have our oil company back. I realized that argument is not going to move the Americans. But knowing the mood in Washington, I decided that I wasn't even going to mention the word oil. Mm-hmm. I would say this has nothing to do with oil. We must overthrow Mossadegh because he is leading Iran toward communism. And that definitely worked. It was the argument that the Dulles brothers used with Eisenhower. And it's peculiar because Mossadegh, as I said, was an elderly feudal landlord who despised all Marxist and socialist ideas. And in fact, we have one moment when this coup proposal is working its way through the American clandestine bureaucracy, where we can see, due to declassified records, that there's a question raised. And the person who raises the question is Eisenhower, who says in one of these National Security Council meetings, first of all, he mutters, "I wish there was some way we could get the people in these downtrodden countries to like us instead of hating us," which of course I'm sure didn't sit well with Foster Dulles. But then he said something like, "I'm glad to hear we're overthrowing this communist Mossadegh, but I didn't understand Mossadegh really as a communist," because of course he was the opposite of a communist. And Dulles had a great answer. He said, "Well, of course you're right. Mossadegh is not a communist, but Mossadegh is old. Mossadegh is sick. He could die. He could be overthrown. Iran has a lot of oil. It's right on the border with the Soviet Union. There's a communist party there. Put all these factors together, it's just too dangerous to let it fester." And that argument was able to win Eisenhower's approval, given the intensity of the moment. You cannot understand why this coup was carried out without understanding the Cold War context. And using that argument, we are going to prevent the Soviets from extending their power, would have won many hearts inside and outside the Eisenhower administration.
This is early on in the Cold War. I mean, can you describe what the Soviet bloc's relationship was towards these events? And, Mossadegh going to New York, he doesn't like them, but would he have any confidence that perhaps the Soviet Union would veto, just to get at the Americans? Or was there any kind of Cold War? Or are we actually seeing previews of kind of the non-aligned movement in Mossadegh?
It's very much the latter. So when Mossadegh was emerging in power, you had the same kind of movements going on everywhere from Laos and Burma and Indonesia to Ghana and the Congo and Guinea. All over the world, you had these new countries emerging. They had been either they had been colonies or they had been dominated by foreign powers. Finally, they were deciding that in the modern post-World War II world, they were going to establish themselves as independent. And they were so focused on developing their countries, which had been left so undeveloped by colonialism, that they didn't want to get involved in the Cold War. They kept saying they wanted to be neutralists. They weren't pro-Moscow, they weren't pro-Washington. This drove John Foster Dulles nuts. He hated neutralists. He actually thought they were worse than communists because he felt that actually they were, witting or unwitting, agents of international communism, pretending to be simply nationalist reformers, waiting for the moment when someone in Moscow would call them and say, "Today's the day," and then overnight they would turn their country into communism. So Mossadegh definitely was a precursor of the rise of the Third World and the desire of developing countries to control their own resources. That is a battle that dominated the Cold War. It's definitely still going on now. But it shows that during the Cold War, there were two ways of looking at the division of the world. The Europeans and the Russians and the Americans looked at it one way. They said the world is divided between the capitalist world led by Washington, and on the other side, there's the communist world led by Moscow. But in many parts of the world, that was not the division. The division they saw was, on one side, there's the Soviet Union, Europe, and America, all the exploitive European powers. And on the other side, there's the countries of Latin America, of Asia, of Africa, that are struggling against those oppressive powers. We were not able to see the world that way because we were so obsessed in seeing the danger in communism. And that's what led us to misjudge so many of these neutralist leaders who really only wanted what was best for their country, but because they were not pro-American in a global Cold War context, we took them as enemies. Mossadegh was the first, but not the last.
as we, sorry, I want to talk as we sort of move into the last little segment of the interview here, just about the coup itself. So let's say I'm Kermit Roosevelt. I want to overthrow Mossadegh. What does that look like? Like, how did he, as one man, with many former British agents in the country that he was working with, but what was the process of organizing first the unsuccessful coup, and then a couple of days later, actually doubling down and successfully ousting Mossadegh?
This is a really interesting story because it answers the question that you're asking. Essentially, you show up in a country, it's Monday morning, first thing, you get to the office, your job is to overthrow the government. So what do? What do you start with? What's your first project? And what's your second project? What do? Well, after writing All the Shah's Men, I began to think, I know so much about that now. Maybe I could hire myself out as a consultant because I really understand how to do these things now. So Kermit Roosevelt really was a real-life James Bond. It's funny because when I was writing All the Shah's Men, I met his son. And he told me, it's so strange you say that because my father was a total klutz. He could not change a light bulb. The only thing he was able to do was play tennis. But other than that, he was hopeless. But somehow he, maybe it was the Roosevelt blood, had the flair for overthrowing governments. So what happened was Kermit Roosevelt arrived in Tehran. One of the first things that he did was begin bribing newspaper publishers and editors and columnists. Within a couple of weeks, he had the majority of the Tehran media on the CIA payroll. Every day there would be articles about Mossadegh being a Jew, a homosexual, a communist, a British agent. It was a constant barrage. In fact, there were so many articles, so much demand for these articles, that the CIA had to start writing some of them themselves because they couldn't even find enough Iranians to write all these articles. Then Kermit Roosevelt bribed religious leaders, mullahs, to denounce Mossadegh from the pulpit as an atheist or an enemy of Islam. He went out and bribed military officers and police units so that they would be ready on at the right moment. Then he decided that the way to strike the blow would be this. Mossadegh was involved in a struggle with the Shah. He had two great goals in his leadership. One was nationalism, which meant in Iran taking back control of the oil. The other was democracy, which meant in Iran that the elected prime minister should rule and the Shah, the king, should just be kind of a symbol of the nation like the king or queen of England. The Shah didn't like this idea. So there was constant conflict there. Kermit Roosevelt played on this. And with various efforts, he finally persuaded the timid Shah to agree to sign two royal orders called firmans. And these firmans authorized, or they gave a kind of legal patina to the coup. One was, Mossadegh, you're fired. The other was, I'm naming this other guy, this general that the CIA has chosen named Zahedi. He's going to be my new prime minister. So on the night of the coup, a few soldiers loyal to the Shah showed up at Mossadegh's house at midnight. They banged on the door, and the idea was, he's going to come down. We give him the royal order that says, you're fired. He will say, that's not possible. You can't fire me. We will then arrest him, and we will claim he's resisting authority. But it didn't work out that way. What happened was that Mossadegh had gotten wind of the coup plot, and he had loyal soldiers waiting in the darkness. And as soon as the coup plotters showed up, they were seized. So the people who had come to arrest Mossadegh were themselves arrested. The next day, the news came out, coup is foiled. The Shah fled the country, he flees to Iraq and then on to Rome, thinks he's never coming back. The coup has failed. And even at the CIA, there was a feeling that the coup probably had failed, and it was time for Kermit Roosevelt to come home. But he didn't do that. He felt he could still make this work. He still had weapons that he hadn't used. So here's what he did in those final days. The first thing he did was something that I might have thought of too. He hired a street gang full of toughs and violent men, and he told them, I want you to run through the streets, I want you to break shop windows, fire your guns into the mosques, beat up people on the street, and yell, "We love Mossadegh and communism." But what he did even beyond that I wouldn't have thought of, is he hired a second mob to attack the first mob he had hired. So within a day or two, Tehran was totally consumed with street fighting and protesting. Gangs were fighting each other, not realizing that they were both in the pay of the CIA. And Mossadegh, with his commitment to democracy, refused to crack down fiercely on these demonstrations. And finally, at the end of that week, Kermit Roosevelt mobilized military units whose commanders he had bribed. They closed in on Mossadegh's house. There was a gun battle that went on for several hours. Several hundred people were killed. And on that night, Mossadegh was overthrown.
Yeah, I mean, it was really, it's such a shocking and telling story, and you told it really well in your book. I did want to, before we get to the end of the interview, just briefly touch on some of the consequences later down the road. One of the things you just mentioned was that the Shah, after the first failed coup attempt, he got on his private plane and he ran away. I actually was surprised to learn what a nervous, kind of unsure character he was. He wasn't really behind it. He just sort of got eventually pushed into it by the CIA, and also his sister was very interested in this concept of overthrowing Mossadegh. But so he came back, and actually there was a funny anecdote in your book about when he heard that Mossadegh's government actually had fallen a couple days later, he yelled, "Oh, I knew they loved me!" He didn't seem to know that everyone had been paid to be a part of this. But so he comes back, and then eventually in the 1979 Islamic Revolution, he has to flee the country. The Shah is given safe passage to the U.S. And so in your book, the line you drew that I thought was super interesting was that right after that is when Americans are taken hostage in the embassy. And your point was that, well, Iranians remembered that in 1953, the Shah fled the country, and 2 days later, their democratic leader was overthrown and he came back. So their feeling was, well, if the Shah gets away and he's not here and he's not facing justice, it's likely the Americans are going to come and overthrow our government again, basically.
This is a really great object lesson that comes out of the story of the Mossadegh coup in 1953. That coup was a success. We got what we wanted. We overthrew a guy we didn't like, Mossadegh, and we replaced him with a guy, the Shah, who would do everything we said. So it seemed like the perfect outcome. And it would have been if only history stopped. But history doesn't stop. History keeps on happening. And the long-term effects of these interventions are often disastrous. If you want to prove that point, Iran is one of your best examples. So just take a brief look at how the effects of the 1953 coup spun out. As you said, after the CIA managed to overthrow Mossadegh, they brought the Shah back. He ruled with increasing repression for the next 25 years. That repression produced the explosion of the late 1970s, what we call the Islamic Revolution. That revolution brought to power a group of fanatically anti-American mullahs who have spent the last 40 years intensely and sometimes quite violently working against American interests all over the Middle East and all over the world. It was also the Islamic Revolution that set off the hostage crisis, as you referred to. So the hostage crisis was seen in the United States, and still, I think, is seen by many Americans, as examples of how uncivilized and how barbaric the Iranians are. By seizing an embassy, they broke every law of God and man, and they did it for no reason. They simply did it because they want to destroy. They're just hateful people. And so we didn't know any more at the time that would help us understand that episode. But since then, several of the hostage takers have written their own memoirs, and they all say the same thing. it wasn't nihilism or anti-Americanism that drove us to do this. It was something very specific. We remembered 1953. What happened then? The people of Iran threw the Shah out. He fled. But CIA agents working in the basement of the U.S. Embassy organized a coup, and they brought the Shah back, and the dictatorship continued. Now here we are in 1979. The Shah has been forced to flee again, the same Shah. Now he's going to the United States. We presume that CIA agents working in the basement of the U.S. Embassy are going to do the same thing they did last time. One of them wrote, we did this in order to prevent history from repeating itself. But Americans didn't see it that way because we didn't know about that first history. At the time of the hostage crisis, no one had any idea in the United States of what had happened in 1953. So the effects of that coup, however, didn't stop there. The overthrow of the Shah was one of those rare geopolitical events in the Cold War that terrified both sides. The Americans hated it, of course, because we lost our great pawn there, the Shah, but the Soviets also hated it. They saw this as a triumph of radical Islam. And of course, the Soviet Union was composed largely of these republics along the southern border, all Muslim dominated. So they were terrified at the idea of radical Islam coming into the Soviet Union. It was partly to prevent that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. That's what brought the United States into Afghanistan and brought us into that whole long mess which we're now trying to extricate ourselves from. And it still doesn't even end there. After the Shah was overthrown and Iran was in upheaval after the 1979 revolution, who should notice this but Iran's greatest longtime enemy, Saddam Hussein, in next door Iraq. He decided this is a great time to invade Iran. And that's what he did. In 1983, Iraq invaded, he invaded Iran. And then the United States decided we hate Iran so much that we're going to support Saddam Hussein. And the President of the United States sent an emissary to meet with Saddam Hussein. He went twice to ask Saddam Hussein, what can we do for you? How can we help you? That emissary was none other than Donald Rumsfeld, who later went on to become the mastermind of the Iraq invasion. So it was that moment that made us a partner of Saddam Hussein, brought us into that death embrace that spiraled down into the catastrophe of the invasion and everything that followed. So a lot of history came out of 3 weeks in the summer of 1953 in Tehran.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why, that's why we wanted to have you on the show to tell us a little bit about this insanely historically, just insanely historical few weeks in Iran. And again, before we go, the book is All the Shah's Men. We hope people will check it out and get to read in more detail about what happened. But it's just super important that we, especially us Americans, know about this history so we can understand current events in the Middle East that much better. So thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us. It was great.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida.
Hi, and welcome back to the committee program from Malmo, Sweden. I'm not getting tired of the sound effect kind of move. I like to do my sound effects live, which hasn't been done since Master and Commander. And I heard they're making a new one, and I hope that they keep the sound effects recorded live. I think it makes a huge difference in the texture and the feel of the first film. Actually, it's probably the only reason that I even enjoy it. This next segment, the reason I enjoy it is because it has all the ingredients: self-determination, anti-colonialism, anti-empire, and hot meme action. And I'm talking, of course, our interview with the Northern Independence Party. Enjoy.
Hey, welcome back. Good to see everyone still here. And we have a really special segment now. We're going to be talking to Philip Proudfoot, who is the founder of the Northern Independence Party. You may not be familiar with them because they are very new on the scene, but actually were founded and contested an election in very short order in the UK, and we'll be talking to him about that. Thank you, Philip, for coming on. And it's
perfect because, as I think was just telling you, we had a long conversation with some folks from Scotland and Catalonia and Kosovo about self-determination, and that's at the heart of your project. Can we just start by you telling me just a little bit about the foundation of the Northern Independence Party? I would say just up front, like people who are impressed with the effort would call it like, the beginning of a new democratic process. And folks who aren't would be like some sort of meme Twitter thing that's gotten out of control. Tell us the actual origin story, since it is you.
Yeah, the meme Twitter thing is funny because it was that at the start, but now we have, things like ratified standing orders. So I think we're like the first meme shitpost party that has an entire web of bureaucratic infrastructure emerging behind it to try and control it. But yeah, we did start partially as a joke, I suppose, but like all good jokes tell you something real. And the reason it founded on the basis of there was a moment in Britain when the approach to lockdown during COVID was to implement like different degrees of lockdown around the country, and the North was kept in lockdown for longer, and Andy Burnham, the mayor of Manchester, because the infection rates were high in the North, and that's for complicated reasons, but Andy Burnham requested additional support, and then central government, which had been guaranteeing an 80% cover on people's lost wages, offered Manchester 67. And it was kind of the most like visceral, in-your-face demonstration of this like deep structural inequality in the UK, which we call like the North-South divide. And then however you look at it sort of statistically, in terms of health, education, take any statistic you look at, you'll see that the North is in a different kind of relationship to the Southeast. And it's not, we find similar phenomena like that across the world, where the capital cities and those areas surrounding it gain more access to sort of wealth, power and privilege. But people don't quite realize, I think, just like how exceptional the UK is in terms of that, in terms of just how much money and investments goes into one tiny corner of the country, and how everywhere else is left to either decline or the population is expected to move away. And the thing about COVID is that it really revealed, like the Secretary General of the UN said that COVID's like an X-ray, reveals the fractures in every society. Well, our fracture is the North-South divide. So we started as like this Twitter page responding to that as a kind of joke. But then I put up I was like, okay, it's gained traction really quickly because this is a sentiment, this is a material reality in the UK that people can connect to. So the moment we put up this Twitter page, suddenly we started getting more and more followers. So then I put up a sign-up form, started a WhatsApp group. The WhatsApp group turned into a Slack office. That then turned into a combined Discord and Slack headquarters. And then suddenly we're getting, we've got thousands of members now. We have a strong income stream. We've contested elections. It may have started kind of a bit joking around with Andy Burnham, King of the North, taking on London, these kinds of sentiments. But it also has become a serious thing. And also, we call the country we want to build Northumbria because the United Kingdom itself isn't an entity that has existed all through history. There was the last time the North was a self-governing polity, it was called the Kingdom of Northumbria, which people don't realise means north of the Humber. The Humber is a sort of a river that comes in marks the beginning of the North, and then all those territories north of that were a separate kingdom. We don't want a kingdom, we just like the name, so we call it Northumbria. Yeah. But it's real, it's a joke, it's multiple things at the same time. But it is a political party now, as well.
One of these things that is through line that we were talking about on that previous panel was that in the 21st century, a lot of these kind of independence projects are a reaction towards wanting to set up a social democratic project in the face of neoliberal opposition. Yeah. One could even almost call it neocolonial when you have something like the UK, which is, of course, a project of empire kind of at its heart. Do you see similarities in what you are doing and, say, with the SNP, where, again, it really is kind of a quest for social democracy, more than some kind of ancient, intractable, fight on the island?
So I have a particular position on the sort of colonial question. The North is not colonized. It was not colonized. It was part of British Empire. The North, while it is the most impoverished part of the UK, it nonetheless benefited from a history of colonial relations around the rest of the world. So the North, for instance,
Yeah. I mean, shipping was going to
shipping, like weapons manufacturing. The biggest
Yeah,
employer
absolutely.
in the Northeast was a weapons manufacturing. So the North was embedded within those broader colonial relations. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the kinds of economic forms of exploitation that existed in the North were not things that were then exported out in a hyper form to Britain's colonial possessions. But the North was embedded within colonialism. But that doesn't mean that breaking up the UK is not a good project for destroying the legacies of colonialism. Ending the UK as a union itself is actually a relatively progressive project in the same way that we see in Scotland. And yeah, I mean, like obviously when you compare the North or Northumbria to Scotland, the similar sort of relationship with Westminster is clear to all. So, for instance, the North would never have ever had, if it was an independent political project, a Tory government. Even in 2019, when people talk about this defeat, I mean, first of all, they've bought the Tory propaganda line, which is that the Red Wall has collapsed. Well, actually, a few seats in the Northeast collapsed, and it would still, if it was an independent country, have produced a progressive democratic socialist government. So we have the same, and the same is true for Scotland. Like Scotland has basically the times in which we've been represented by the government we voted for since the birth of democracy in the UK is about 30% of the time. And it does not seem like anyone in Westminster is keen on transforming the electoral system. So the same kind of like arguments around how do we actually build democratic socialism in the UK has to move on with Scotland and Wales to viewing that the biggest enemy to democratic socialism is the UK itself as a political entity. It's designed to prevent not even wild democratic socialism, just something a bit better than what we have now is not possible within the union. So yeah, it is part of that. We do connect with that kind of progressive part of the SNP. Yeah.
I mean, I think to some folks who even think of a United Confederation that is the geopolitical entity that the UK encompasses, would maybe even be improved by making England a bit smaller. That it's sort of a bit of a too big of a gorilla to play well with other entities. So I mean, one could almost argue that some kind of project like this could also restore a confederated union of folks by making something more stable. But let me ask you, I guess, maybe the trickiest question, which is now, and as a person who, is not reporting on this, but does campaigns for a living, like the easy fruit, the low-hanging fruit has been gathered. The people who are sort of very ripe and a little sour on labor, who are really ready to hear you, between 6 and 10%, even some places, which is quite a lot, is great. As you know, every percentage you go higher than that becomes harder and harder to get.
Yeah.
What are the things you're going to do to try to get more people to become a sustained, viable party that's actually competing to win places? And it must be, and sorry to like feed the answer to the question, but it must be more than just getting disaffected labor folks, because otherwise you're both just trying to park in the same parking spot. And it maybe does allow others to slip through more easily. Like, how do you make kind of a holistic appeal to all kinds of? You tell me.
Well, I think that we really haven't captured all of those Labour folks actually, because if you look at the local elections, most people who would have voted Labour, we haven't got the full analysis yet, but they seem to have stayed home and not voted for us. Some might have voted for the Greens. So I think there's still actually quite a huge proportion of people that we will ultimately begin to appeal to. We also hope to, obviously it's very early days, we're 6 months old, but like one of the segments of the population we can directly appeal to are those who bought into, and it's complicated, but bought into the kind of Brexit type agenda. Mm-hmm. So those people who feel that their towns have been left behind and that they blame the European Union for that. when I say that, I'm not pretending the European Union is some sort of like an actor, a benevolent actor that isn't involved in that process whatsoever. But nonetheless, that sentiment of wanting to take back control, that great slogan, like that would connect to a lot of people who hope to see positive change in these like left behind regions of the UK. And on that front, the reason why we think we can appeal to them through independence is that in the history of sort of an attempt to devolve powers in the UK, in 2004 there was a referendum in the northeast. Northeast is the poorest part of England, where I'm from. There was an attempt to establish an assembly, kind of what they have in Wales, but even less power. The man who led that campaign to stop that happening, 80% of people voted against it. The man who led that campaign, do you know who he was? Do you know who he is? Dominic Cummings. Dominic Cummings led the anti-Northeast referendum campaign, and he led it on a platform we'd agree with, and a platform that we think would sweep up those kind of like very angry people.
He's no dummy, right?
He's not like, his campaign was, this is an expensive talking shop. The people don't want more. They don't want more politicians. They want power. And the sort of argument for devolution is always going to end up being framed through, oh, well, here's some more expensive politicians. Here's another layer of representatives between you and the people who actually control control power, control finances, control the treasury. Just more talking until you actually get to it. So independence as a claim is saying, no, actually what we're going to do is we're going to put power right in the heart of the North, and then we'll take back control of our own. So you can see there's that appeal there, and what you're doing, which is so if you look at what Labour did in terms of their campaign, it was to have Keir Starmer stand in front of a flag and hold a pint and kind of nod and wink to that sort of reactionary nationalism in the North. What we're doing is we're trying to take that and point it in what we would see as the right direction, which is a particular economic model that has allowed for the depopulation of these small towns, has destroyed our communities, has forced all of our all young people to move away. It's not the blame for that does not fall on migrants. It does not fall on all these other places in which the Tories would want to position that blame. It falls on the Westminster system, and trying to point that anger towards a correct form of analysis, and doing so we could sweep up that 10-15% of voters. Disaffected voters, we're going to work at appealing to them as well through the sort of like through the like bold proposal to do something radically different, and we're going to really focus on like building local candidates going forward. Like we've got a candidate academy. We're identifying people within the party who sit in like potential marginal seats. And then we even have Tories. We even have former Tories now joining the Northern Independence Party, and they join as well on the basis of the North-South divide. Our biggest problem is that because of the North-South divide, people who have the time and capacity to engage in politics, they tend to live in the Southeast because they're not working in like crap jobs in the North, and they have like a bit of time free, and they're not exhausted through like various forms of like, manufacturing is still relatively high in the North as a form of labour. So we actually need to find a way in which people in the South can support our movement while not being members if they don't feel it's for them, even though we are trying to build a radically different country in the same way that Scotland is, that would be welcoming and whatever. So you can see there are actually all these broad coalitions that we're trying to figure out how to bring in, but it's a work in progress. We're brand new.
How, and to me, yes, you're brand new, and obviously, you're exhausted coming off of, 6 months followed by an election this week. But what, as you're looking forward, as you're recruiting candidates, and as you're thinking about messaging, what seems to me the broadest challenge you have, especially in the coalitions you're talking about building, is the fact that Labor, many others, I don't even want to single out Labor there, have cynically kind of confused white nationalism with working class pride for decades and decades. And this seems to me to be a big problem because I have not been as far in travel to the Northeast, certainly a place you're from, but in the 2019 elections, I was in the Midlands a lot. I was talking to people in places like Wolverhampton. I do have some idea of the kind of, when you get out of London, what people are feeling. But the most effective organizers I saw were definitely people in the pockets of communities of color, especially. This is where real organizing that was effective was happening. So you want to make sure, even tactically, as you're putting together a coalition, to make sure that those folks feel welcome coming in. How are you balancing that out? And it's a problem that you're inheriting. Again, that's decades old. So if you don't have a brilliant answer right off the cuff, do not feel bad.
Well, we're directly confrontational with that. Like, nothing, like, one of the reasons we set up the party is that structural economic thing. But for me, like, that issue around whatever we want to call it, identity, culture, the way in which we've been, like, portrayed as sort of like people from the North are sort of reactionary bigots, that upsets me. I'm trying to not use harsh language here a great deal. And I often talk about this, right? When I was growing up, right, in my granddad lives in a small left behind town in northeast Durham, in northwest Durham. There is a house there near his house where they would fly a big Union flag, and we were told as children, don't go and play there. They're weirdos, because they were like BNP members. These were like the outriders. And if you look even at the history of sort of reactionary politics in the UK, it's very difficult to identify a sort of right-wing fascist racist leader who emerged in the north of England. What tends to happen is they're from the southeast. I'm not saying that this is an essential thing. I'm just talking about what we see historically. And then they attempt to take the north.
No, it's important, because there is the narrative versus reality, and one has taken over.
Is that we're the bigots, and we produce these like sort of racists who then but then Nigel Farage, where's he from, right? Where's Tommy Robinson from? Where's like Nick Griffin from? Where's like Oswald Mosley from? Point to me one leader of sort of British fascism who is from the north, other than they try and take the north. And everyone knows about like the Battle of Cable Street, but there are also lots and lots of battles like that in the history in the north where we pushed back fascism as well. But because the real reason why that sort of the problem is that these northern safari journalists, they go to Wetherspoons in the middle of the day in the north, and they find a drunk who's saying something ridiculous. They'll get that ridiculous shot of that drunk saying something. And I would wager, even with that drunk guy, if you kept with him and you kept talking, you would actually find that what's informing that like ridiculous racist position he says is not some like deep-seated like commitment to fascism. It's largely just a misdirection of his anger that's a product of all sorts of sort of media educational like manipulation that can be like, it's just deeply frustrating to have that sort of the way in which the North is represented. And like, under Corbyn's problem was that those sentiments were left to grow. They were not directly tackled. They were sort of like pushed aside. There were those moments where like, there were those videos put out where Corbyn was saying like some guy was blaming migrants, and then like there's a guy like telling him, no, don't blame migrants, right? Okay, fine. There was that stuff. But then under the Tories are perfectly happy to just play with it, exaggerate it, use it to build their electoral power. And now Keir Starmer is doing like basically the same thing, and I think it has to be tackled head on. And one of the ways in which you do that is like some of our projects. We'll be starting our own podcast. We're going to try and have our own media where we talk about the history of like anti-fascism in the North, because I could go on and on about this, but if you think about it's a product of the North-South divide. So like most activism and organizing and things like that tends to be done in the Southeast anyway. So we're already not front and center of the conversation. So then if you look at things like, the Windrush scandal, it kind of gets a London-centric take on it, when actually huge elements of the Windrush community were in Liverpool. And like Liverpool kind of gets forgotten in all of these narratives itself, and kind of seen as an outrider. And then there's just so much work that can be done to try and reverse this representation of the North that is inaccurate. I mean, one of the things, for Ramadan, we put out our Ramadan message had an image of South Shields Yemeni community that's lived in Yemen, that's lived in South Shields for hundreds of years, and people don't know about like this like idea that it's a monolithic white block when actually we have these communities that have lived for hundreds of years in South Shields. I mean, this is another example of this. There's a Roman fort in the northeast called Arabeum, I think, and the reason is that the soldiers stationed there were from Mesopotamia. So the north has been international since. I mean, they were soldiers stationed in the northeast, okay, but still, nonetheless, it's been international for centuries. But nonetheless, it gets portrayed, and it really is a huge annoyance for me, and one of the reasons why I started it is also coming up against that same idea among people who I would expect to be comrades in London, thinking, oh, the North, they all vote Brexit, they're all bigots, London has the monopoly over diversity, London is it's a sore spot.
So, I mean, what are next steps in terms of elections, kind of that you all want to contest, to make sure that these narratives get cemented? What's going on? What's up?
So we are likely at the moment now going to focus really hard on like building the party, because we were rushed so quickly into that election. We approached that election basically as using the by-election as a megaphone, and we increased our membership by several thousand thanks to that by-election, and that was basically the intention, was to use it as a means to gain even more media representation. So we got lots and lots of articles in The Guardian, in the New Statesman, to try and pick up those members who you mentioned earlier, disaffected Labour supporters, because while a lot of our membership are people who've never been engaged in politics, some of them are disaffected Labour members, and we deliberately try to pick them up because they are incredibly talented activists, etc. So now we have that membership, we have those resources. We're now going to try and basically really focus on building the organisation, building the different units, research units, the campaigns unit. We also, as we're now moving out of lockdown, a lot of people say, why aren't you? You're all online. You don't do community organising. I mean, for God's sake, we've been in a pandemic where we can't really do that. Ethically, we don't have liabilities we didn't have liabilities insurance. Now we have an infrastructure in place where we can actually start doing community organising, and that's the next step. Basically, is that we're going to do everything that the Labour Party should be doing. Is basically the plan. So if you look at somewhere like Hartlepool, there was that vicar who runs a food bank who spoke out against Keir Starmer. Mm-hmm. In no world should a vicar who's running a food bank be feeling disconnected from the Labour Party. The Labour Party should be like front and centre, maximising those voices. They should be funneling volunteers into these initiatives. This is like core parts of like what it means to be, I think, like a democratic socialist in your everyday life. So we're going to then start moving into not making up we're not going to, all these initiatives exist. We're just going to help funnel our activists to start doing like immediate practical solidarity.
I think being helpful with social services is one of the big components that's missing in kind of modern socialism.
Yeah. And like I had a debate, right, with a new Northern Tory for Barrow-in-Furness, and the Conservative Party in the UK is starting to adopt the tactics of community organising, community wealth building, and then Labour are just doing like focus groups, flags and pints. So it's just like, when you say, again, talking about who we're going to pick up, Labour will continue to shed members and shed votes. Like, it's just I can't get my head around what they're doing. So yeah, the next steps are basically we want to become a force in the community now that we're out of lockdown. Obviously, we weren't doing that during lockdown. And a lot of the problems we faced are to do with the fact we were an online movement by necessity. So yeah, those are the next steps, basically.
Cool. And when you all have your leadership elections to sort of formally democratically enshrine the process, we would love to check in, just because I think it's interesting watching a party kind of come to grips with its democratic processes. We were talking last week about Cinque Stelle, which is sort of one of the first people to kind of toy around with these, at least online ideas of coming together. But Philip, thank you so much for coming on and explaining to us what's going on in the North, and we appreciate you.
Thank you for inviting me.
We are back. Thanks so much for being with us. The next segment was actually the special interview we did with Liz Dapo, who is a puppeteer, who is a historian, who is quite frankly a genius. I had a lot of people talking about how cool they thought the puppets were, and we're going to do some more things with them next season, I hope. And so, reintroducing the puppets seemed like it wouldn't be the worst idea.
Hey, Liz. I'm not trying to get involved in your private life or anything, but I was going through your desk and I found these. Oh, Liz, don't you know birth control is abortion?
But it isn't abortion.
Look, Liz, your boss shouldn't have to pay for all those abortions.
Well, good talking to you.
Hello, Washington, D.C. This is your political machine. I'm out here on the street today to find out why people might support Muriel Bowser. Sir, what do you think of Muriel Bowser? No comment. I don't know where the money came from.
Look, folks, I'd love to marry you, even though it's 4:53 p.m. on a Friday and I really have somewhere to be. But the fact of the matter is, I can't because of my religion. You know what I mean? Where would it all end up?
Keep marriage open for all happy couples across our great nation.
I told you nobody likes your monocle. It's ridiculous.
Everyone loves monocles. They can kiss my puppet ass.
Thank you, God bless you, and God bless the United States of the Uteri.
If you think this sounds crazy, how would you feel if it were going on in Maryland schools?
Visit marylandeducators.org/get-it-right to learn more. This computer seems to be broken.
Texas extremes past bullshit schemes make laws clinics can't abide. We fought in vain, now 6 remain. Access sure to be denied.
I'm sure they are lovely people, sir, but I'm afraid Michigan has taken the unusual step of requiring women to carry rape insurance.
I'm sorry.
What? Yep. In Michigan, a new law requires women to get extra health insurance, just in case she gets raped and needs abortion care.
Just let me help you find the Cory Gardner tab.
There is no way I'm voting for Cory Gardner.
What? He loves the ladies. Said so himself a bunch of times.
But he'd make most forms of birth control illegal.
You seem kind of obsessed with sex, Liz. It's very unhealthy. Just vote for Cory. Come on.
Hello, everybody. You know, in all of my years of being a political machine, there's one thing that helps me find solace in all of the hectic noise of Washington. It's so easy being green, spending cash the color of the leaves, or maybe red or yellow.
Hey, yo, Liz, what are you up to?
I told you I was gonna go vote about 15 minutes ago at the office.
Right. I just wanted to make sure you were voting for Tom Tillis. I hear is really good for the lady voters. Is there a special word for voters when they're ladies? Hey, welcome back to the show. And what you were just seeing is actually videos that were made by our next guest, Elizabeth Dapo. All of these at the company I used to work at, Revolution Messaging, where we sort of got a reputation for making a lot of puppet videos, but in fact, the genius behind it all is Elizabeth Dapo, who's here with us today. And she's currently the artistic director of Puppet Co. and a friend of the show. So thank you so much for coming on, Elizabeth.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, this is the things that we say when we come on shows. We're doing it right.
We're doing it right. I think I've seen enough Good Morning America, so I think I've got this.
You're not just a craftsperson, you are also an academic. Can you actually just give us your background? Because when I start asking you some questions, I don't want people to think that I'm this huge, obnoxious person. You actually have the answers.
Sure. I've been a professional puppeteer since about 2010.
I have my undergrad in acting and directing from Binghamton, but I got my graduate degree in puppetry and device performance from the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama in London.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, which is super impressive, and which I think probably steeps you in more of the background of this. And I would say, I think one of the things that we found so useful in using puppets is how much more human than human they can be when it comes to our ability to put empathy on them, but also our ability to accept them as somewhat two-dimensional. I mean, what do you think about the sort of interplay of what is special and different about a puppet theater versus the regular theater? And how does that play into satire?
Well, I think it's really interesting because I think, historically speaking, puppets have been able to get away with things that people haven't been able to get away with for centuries. Anytime that performances were halted or stopped because people were inciting riots or things were getting really interesting or testy in countries, puppets were still allowed to perform because their opinions were considered trivial, which meant that people weren't actually looking at them as instigators, but in all reality, they were the ones that were communicating some of these bigger political messages and these hierarching themes that were really pulsating through communities at the time. I think we can look at puppets sometimes. You know, one of the big questions that puppeteers ask themselves when they're creating something is, why puppets? So why do I use a puppet as opposed to putting a person in this place? And a big part of that is, you can make these images of these famous, of these people. You can characterize them, you can satirize them, and then you have an object that speaks for them. And that is so unique and so special in itself, because suddenly, there's a spitting image in the UK it went through its thing, and then it's coming back now, which is really interesting. But like Margaret Thatcher, they had a great Margaret Thatcher puppet that would bash the heads of people. In the brain bashing, so like driving home those points. But you can do it with a puppet because the puppet is still an object. It's not a person going out and saying their opinion. So I think it's really fascinating in that regard that these, as you kind of put it, a two-dimensional object, this object takes on this whole new life and goes and can go in any direction.
But I do want to drill on this a little farther because there's something special here, because they're not cartoons in that, cartoon violence, Tom and Jerry, Itchy and Scratchy, or whatever, it's not the same. I think we import more human value on puppet, maybe because of the physicality of it, maybe for some other reasons. But the tension that I saw in the work we did together was in thinking about, we have this really broad strokes thing. We can have Margaret Thatcher bashing someone over the head, this kind of thing, with that balanced with the advice that you would give me in my amateur, trying to pantomime along with you while we would do puppet things, which was smaller is bigger, subtlety is what reads in puppetry. This is the opposite of cartoons.
Yeah, it is. And
there's no straight faces
I think part of it, as children, when we watch shows that are geared for children, we put ourselves into those puppets' positions. So the reason that you might love a beloved character is because you can see some part of yourself in it, or you ascribe that emotion to it. So if a puppet shows you that it's happy or sad, it really isn't smiling. It really isn't changing its expression. It changes its body language a little bit. But you as a child look at it and go, oh, I get this. I can read this emotion. And it's still a tangible thing. I think that's what's really important, is especially like with theater, it's something, it's not a screen, there's no distancing, you are there with that object live, which is really fascinating. And I think cartoons have taken some of their lead from some styles of puppet theater, because if you think about like more modern cartoons that do satire, like, the big ones that are out there, you can look back at puppetry and you can look back at Commedia dell'arte and you can see the origins of attacking things with satire. It's really an interesting, very long history that goes behind it.
Yeah, and especially when I'm thinking of things like the French Revolution and, sort of especially kind of things done with the masses where it's better to have something that's not written, etc. This is all after the printing press, but it still is more helpful. What do you think is the relationship between sort of ridicule as a tactic and puppetry, and even some of the work that we did together. Like, because this is something that maybe normally I'd counsel against when, if you can make fun of Donald Trump, don't ridicule his figure, speak towards his policy or something like that. But with the puppets, it somehow is a license to maybe play around with that more. I don't know. Like, it seems to be, I guess it matters which direction it's pointing, up towards the king or down towards the people. But please go ahead.
Oh, it absolutely does, and it's puppetry has been used on both sides. Like you were saying, the French Revolution. There's actually a case where a puppeteer had little guillotined people, and as people were being guillotined in real life, right next to the stage was a puppeteer guillotining people along with it, and showing people, look how ridiculous this absolutely is that's happening. There were a lot of parlor style shows that were happening in the French Revolution too, where people would come in and do little tiny shows that couldn't be shut down because they were parlor, things.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's fascinating because both sides have used it. The governments have used puppetry to get a message across or to stop a people from rising up to try to crush down or push people down. But the majority of puppetry has been used for the underdog, the little guy, to get their message across, to really try and throw it back in the government's face. And we get away with a lot more because I think when it's an object, there was a Trump puppet, a puppeteer named Brian Carson made a really great Trump puppet, and he was on Twitter the whole time. And he was a caricature of Donald Trump. So he had the big our little guy, you have him, it's so great. But you've got that, you overemphasize certain physical characteristics, and you can get away with that more than if you had a person like, when you have actors on Saturday Night Live doing it, then it's immediately called out. But if it's a puppet, we still have that gray area where we're okay with overemphasizing characteristics in puppetry that we're not okay with human people portraying. Fascinatingly, the Nazis took over some of there's a very famous puppet theater or puppet show called Punch and Judy. And Punch is this little guy who is spawned from Commedia, has deep roots coming from Italy, moving through. And Punch beats everybody up. Punch abuses his wife. Punch abuses his kid. He throws him off the stage at some point. Punch attacks a crocodile, and eventually Punch bests the devil. So Punch is supposed to represent the little man. He has a cousin in Germany, Casper.
Mm-hmm.
And during the Nazi occupation, it was decreed that all puppet shows would no longer portray Casper in a traditional way because he looked, quote, too Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And the government went so far as to x-ray puppet heads to know the lineage of the puppet. Because if somebody had taken their head and resculpted a nose, then they would say this puppet is too Jewish, you can't use it. And that's, on one side of the coin, that's how puppetry was used against people. But then on the other side, right across the pond, Mr. Punch was dressed up as Winston Churchill and beating up Hitler. So the same character just twisted for different purposes. And I think it's all, it's all a matter of what is happening at the moment in time.
We put a lot on these little guys. What
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean? It's a lot for a puppet to bear in this world. Is there a difference? We're talking about a lot of traditions probably coming out of the Renaissance, other things, it's Europe. In Asia and shadow puppets, this is more of an elite tradition. And so do you see more of that top-downness maybe in the stories that are told coming out of that tradition? Or is that anything that makes sense to you?
Yeah, so you have it both ways again. You have, even though it was, it's considered an elite tradition, it still means it's for every person to enjoy. So there are different points of history, especially in China, where puppets were not only used to propagate what was being decreed, what was being said, but also on the lower tiers of society, it was being used to tell the fairy tales that were no longer being able to be told, to tell the stories and the folk heroes, because it still inspired people to rise up. And puppets were allowed to do it when people weren't allowed to do it. So you had shadow puppets and you had all these beautiful different styles, and they could still perform because it was considered high art still, but they weren't being censored nearly as often as acting troupes were. And you see that not only like European countries. America is relatively, I've tried to find more and more history about before colonization, what were the early American indigenous peoples, what was their version of a puppet, because every culture has
As
one.
a representative kind of
Yes.
object. Yeah.
Right. So like the Hopi, the little Zunis, they can also be considered a style of puppet because they're representative of a god, in that little form. It's just once like American puppetry really kicked off in the 1920s. And I'm also one of my current research ideas is to try to find more information about how, if enslaved people in the early part of the United States, how were they using puppets? Was puppetry something that came over from the African culture, and how was it part of the South? It's very hard to find anything about this. It's hard to find if there's any information anywhere, but I can't imagine it wasn't there somehow.
Yeah.
It's all fascinating, but every culture in the world has that instance of either somebody's pushing them down and puppets are there to push back.
I mean, fast forward though, because I would love to hear more about America in the parts that unfortunately we do have more information about. But, I think about the 60s, the 1960s, and kind of, the ideas like bread and puppets, I think is in Vermont, right? Or these kind of
bread and puppet is like the quintessential political puppet movement in the United States.
Does that come out of like American vaudeville and stuff, or is there sort of a unique like puppet tradition that you see starting as a folk tradition in America, probably in the 1800s sometime?
I think honestly, bread and puppet is sort of a unique creature, but it of course has its roots throughout American puppetry. In Appalachia, in West Virginia, there is a whole troupe of puppeteers that were just up in the mountains that were telling these stories, and they had a huge folk influence. Using stylized American music with puppets, with a very unique style of American puppets. Bread and puppet, brainchild of one man who basically was like, "Hey, we're going to do this thing." But in Chile, in Peru, in different parts of Africa, these huge effigies have always been used to represent people that maybe were not the most popular humans, like Mexico. I was just reading something the other day about Frida Kahlo, who brought back this Judas Day, where they would make these massive puppets that were effigies of Judas. But what they would do is decorate them to look like local officials that they didn't like, or police constables that they were not fans of, and then they would they'd parade them through town and light them on fire. And it got banned for years and years and years, and then basically Frida Kahlo brought it back. So these beautiful traditions all play into, and it's really hard not to think that everything that's happening culturally, artistically, on stage, in music, in visual art, doesn't have an influence on every other art form that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're looking at like German Expressionism, then you can see how it has influences on the puppet style at the time. Or if you're looking at a certain type of music that overtook a generation, you can see that in the puppetry being developed. Like you can almost hear it in certain puppeteers in how they worked and how they made stuff. So I think everything feeds into everything else, but it always has something to do with, where's the world at the moment? The 60s and 70s, Vietnam in the United States, this this really hard cultural clash happening, and then these giant puppets showing up, and they hand out bread, homemade bread, when they, you go to a performance and you get bread and you get theater and you get brought into this great fold of people, and they do really hard-hitting political stuff, and then sometimes it's just really like, oh, butterflies in a field, this is great. So we have to really dive in and look at what's happening around us sometimes. I don't know if you know Theater for a New City in New York. They do a great, Crystal is the lady, and of course I'm blanking on her last name, but she has done this tour of parks in New York City where she takes this show out that she writes every year, and every year it's highly political, and every year it has puppets in it. So in New York City, it's still happening. The last time that I was up there, she was doing this show about how shit she thought the last administration was. And she was very vocal about taking it to public parks, and anybody could come see it. And that's kind of the beauty of it, is anybody can come see it. It's open for anybody. You don't have to pay a ton of money. It's not like going to the opera where you can feel out of place, even though you shouldn't. It's not like having an exclusive ticket to something. Puppets basically open access to everybody. Okay, I've ranted.
No, it's so true, and it's so nice. And I think it's one of the reasons that we, found so much use for them. But now let's put on your craft hat, take off the academic hat, and let's talk about our relationship, basically, which is like, I present you with a problem. We are creating a splash page to show off our new digital smart capabilities. So what we really need from you is Gritty, the Philadelphia hockey team. We have some Europeans on here, so I don't know who Gritty is. But Gritty,
I love it.
So he's a mascot for a hockey team. He's a nihilist. He has sort of reputation. He's great, and he's running for president. And so we give you that, and you give us this. Here he is. So just walk me through what happened. I tell you that we need Gritty, but he needs to be running for office, and so you get to work. So talk to me.
So your projects were always really interesting, because you'd say, hey, it's Friday, and I would if we could have this by next Tuesday, that'd be great. And I would go, yes, absolutely, yes. Let's try to figure this out. So what I do first is I go, Gritty, okay, great. Let's find all the information I can find on Gritty. Who is Gritty? What does he look like? But also, what is he currently standing for with who he is? When Gritty first came out, he was not well received by the public. Everybody was like, what is this abomination?
Yeah.
Bring back our beloved, we don't want this. But then Gritty slowly took on this punk rock subculture feel of anything happening was because Gritty said
the
so.
Underdog of the underdog who always wins. Yeah.
Yes, and that's the thing, is he got so big, and then during the most recent election, there were so many Gritty memes, and he's definitely used by this. I won't even say it's left. It's more progressive, but it's like this progressive punk movement that's happening. Anarchists love Gritty. They're everywhere on Facebook is Gritty. So I look at all of how is Gritty being used, and then I go, okay, great. I know what context he exists in here. How do I make him exist in this world that he wouldn't normally exist in, of he's running for a public office?
Yeah.
So we get, he's got a nice suit on, and then I just start building. And I will say, I have learned so much by you telling me giving me these tight deadlines, but also giving me this fantastic motivation, because it encouraged me as an artist to keep pushing and growing and pushing and growing. And the thing is now, I have come so far the last 3 years in terms of being a builder, because I learned so much from having to play on the fly. When we did Eunice.
Yes.
Eunice was a 6-hour turnaround. So you told me I need a uterus
you will
that
have
talks.
seen in the video, she is the uterus who represents Abortion AF, which is a reproductive rights group out of Brooklyn, New York.
Woo!
Which I'm
But we had 6 hours And that's what the timeline I had, because I was like, finish this job, make puppet, give puppet. That's the timeline I have. So I sat down with a huge iced tea, as I'm prone to do, with lots of caffeine. And I went, okay, here's what my Google search history is great. Because it's like, what's uterus? You know, everything. I have looked for everything. So my first step is research. And then I got to ask, why are we using a puppet? What does the puppet need to be able to do that, you know, a human can't do? And obviously, an object is something fantastic. An organ can't speak for itself. So let's make it the mouthpiece for this great, you know, movement. And then I just start playing around with materials. Is this going to work? Is this going to work? And as I have found out, sometimes the best ideas are not your first ideas, your second ideas, or your third ideas. When we made our two little marionette guys, we went through a process there because I really
They were the Koch brothers,
wanted to.
Dear viewer, it's just so that you know. Yeah, and they are.
Yes, they were.
I have them around someplace. They are just the creepiest.
They're really creepy. They are on my rebuild list because I want to make more. They're too uncanny valley, which is something you'll hear puppeteers and, you know, people will say with AI. Is the uncanny valley is if we mimic too close to what humans actually look like, people don't want to see it.
Totally.
So you have a very fine balance to walk when you're designing something of caricature versus hyper-realism. These guys were a little too hyper-real. They had teeth. It was a little much. But you kind of, you know, you figure that out, and then you just play with materials and you see what sticks and you see what doesn't, and you learn from that process so that the next time around when you're doing, you know, if you're saying, hey, I need another puppet, it's going to be this style, you have the basis set up and you can keep going forward.
And for anyone who's
so it's a lot of fun.
Anyone who thinks this isn't absolutely literally true, not that long after Eunice, we were working for a heart group, and we had to then make a talking heart, which actually came out really good. Cora,
yep.
Who was going to be the spokeswoman for the Women's Heart Alliance, yeah.
So it's and it's a challenge, but also at the same time, it's so much fun, you know. And getting to do what I consider a one-off project where we made Gary and Jill, you know, we did it. We made them. They're out there in the world. It's fantastic, as opposed to designing an entire show, which is a whole different beast. You know, that requires a lot of time, a lot of research, and then usually you're building maybe 10 to 20 puppets. The biggest build I ever did was a 40 puppet show,
That seems like a lot.
which was insanity. I don't recommend it for the amount of time and money that I had behind the project. Don't recommend it.
Now just have them change clothes, you know what I mean? You need more outfit changes and fewer puppets.
That show was really fun. It was Cannibal the Musical, the Trey Parker and Matt Stone show. And one of the puppets had to get shot. So we had to make a puppet that was a trick puppet that you could wash its face and look normal, and then the next day, blood would just shoot out of its forehead at the audience. And then make sure that it was okay the next day. So we had puppets like that. There was a whole sequence of black and white puppets that got killed in different ways. Like one of them was an alien chest
So it's like
burster.
the puppets themselves are the color of the flashback.
Yeah, they were black and white puppets, and we had a black and white background.
Yeah.
And so it was a flashback told that way. And then, you know, the only thing that was in color was, of course, the red of them dying. And then somebody would walk out and pick a puppet up and be like, and that's what really happened. But 40 puppets, that was a big show.
Before I let you go, though, I know it's a hard time for performers of all stripes, but especially theater performers. How is that, and what can people do to make sure that they can even virtually participate in your upcoming season at the Puppet Co?
I will say performers have absolutely been struggling. COVID shut down everything that we as a community had to offer. I know so many people who lost so much money and income and gigs this year. It's not even, and I know it's global. You know, I know that it's everybody everywhere, but it's an industry that won't come back first. We were the first to shut down, and we will be the first to open. And it's because our theater in particular does a lot of children's theater. So children not being able to be vaccinated means we can't open as soon as like big theaters like the Kennedy Center. We have to
think about that.
take that into
Yeah,
consideration.
That's true.
Some theaters are able right now to open at 25% capacity. If we open at 25% capacity, we don't cover the bills for the day. So grants, I'm really excited and thankful that there are so many programs that exist where we can get grants, where we can get some funding, where we've been able to keep the lights on in a proverbial sense. But what I would really recommend, if this is of any interest to anybody, find your local theater groups, ask if they're accepting donations, find out how you can donate to them. Are they doing any online programming? Are they on social media? If they're on social media, give them a like, give them a boost. It helps people find their page. We do free puppet showings every Friday at 10:30. They're all the shows that we pre-recorded before the pandemic. We're offering them for free so that people have something to do with their kids. And we've been pretty consistent. There's only been a couple of weeks where somebody forgot that it was Friday, with me, and didn't post a video. But for the whole week, you can watch one of these, pre-recorded shows. And it's just word of mouth. When we can open, we want people to come back. We don't want people to be afraid. We're trying to take all the precautions possible, but we want people to know we still exist. And I think that's important on a global level. Find those little communities, support those little communities. A lot of puppeteers wear a lot of hats. I'm the artistic director, but I'm also a puppeteer, and I'm also the director, and I'm also the editor currently, and I'm also the filmographer currently, and I'm also the sound editor currently, and I'm also the building manager currently. So that's not unusual in puppetry. Lots of people do a lot of roles. So, find those communities, support those communities, and when people are able to reopen, give them your support if you can. I know everybody's hurting, and it's been a weird, weird year, but that's the best way that you can help these artists make it through.
Elizabeth Dapo, thank you so much for coming on, and maybe someday we will be able to pressure institutions to care about the theater like they care about sports, and then there'll be some real investment in the thing we care about.
I hope so. Yep, that would be fantastic.
Thanks so much. See ya.
Thank you. Bye.
Hi, and thanks for joining us on the committee program for our In Case You Missed It episode, highlighting some of our favorite moments. Instead of reading from the big book of readings, which I have been reunited with, I thought I would just take time to sincerely thank those of you who have been watching us from the beginning, and of course, encouraging you to follow us, not just here, but also in podcast form on iTunes, at patreon.com/committee program, at fans.fm/committee. All of these ways that you can get involved. We do plan on taking the show forward, maybe in new and interesting ways, maybe in new and not interesting ways, but sincerely, on behalf of myself, of Fiamma, of Forrest, of Julie, of Xhevat, of Ahmed, of the whole committee gang, thank you so much for watching, and we hope to see you next time.